Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and paying my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to remind us that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to this very important conversation event with Nimco Ali. Tonight, we're in for a very, very special evening. She's also my very first international guest. She's come all the way from London, and she is trained as a lawyer. She now works full-time as an activist on the issue of female genital mutilation, FGM, and I would like, without any further ado, to welcome to the stage Nimco Ali. We're going to be talking tonight about the subject of FGM, and we're going to be covering it in a variety of ways. We're going to start off with a personal reflection, because Nimco is going to share with you her personal story. Before I ask her to do that, you have something you'd like to say about...
Yeah, thank you for all coming out, and thank you, Anne, for inviting me. And I think the last week since I've been in Australia, this whole idea of giving thanks back to the original owners and our ancestors has been something that I found really amazing, which we don't hear about in the UK. But I'd just like to start my conversation ultimately with giving thanks to the survivors that told their stories before me, and also Efwa Dokulu, who was my mentor and passed away this time last year. Because if it wasn't for women like her, I don't think I'd be able to have the strength to be here today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to start, Nimco, by asking you to tell us, when you were 7 years of age, you were taken to Africa and you were subjected to cutting. Could you tell us about what that meant to you and how you felt about it?
Yeah, so I had FGM when I was 7 years old. I was in Djibouti at the time, and I was on holiday, so essentially it wasn't something that was necessarily planned or something that I knew was going to happen, but it did. And
you didn't know it was going to happen?
No, I didn't.
You weren't told?
No, it was something that it was completely random, and I do remember the actual act itself. So I remember seeing the cutter and everything else, but I think ultimately for me it was coming back to the UK and having my experience dismissed, which was one of the things that really stood out for me. I came back.
Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I came back to the UK after having FGM and being cut, and there was no conversation around it it's going to happen, or what it was or anything else. So when I came back to the UK, I really wanted to kind of just get some information about what this ridiculous act was. And I remember coming back to my teacher, who was the same form teacher as I had the year before, and asking her, like, this really weird thing happened to me. And her reply was one of the kind of fundamental things that kind of shaped my life and shaped my view. It was, this is what happens to girls like you. And that was a complete dismissal of who I was and what I was. And for me, it was like, it took a long time for me to ever share that conversation, have that story again. So yeah, I had no idea what a girl like me meant. And then at the age of 11, I had a defibrillation, which is the reversal of type 3 FGM, which is...
This is because you had a kidney infection?
Yeah, I had kidney infection.
So one of the things that we're going to be just referring to, at least tonight, is that FGM for, the practice is a very, very tough one, and we don't like to use words like barbaric, and you'll explain to us why you don't like that language. But there are all kinds of medical complications that can occur in addition to just the simple cutting, and this is what happened to you. Right?
Yeah, ultimately, because I had the most invasive form of FGM. There are 4 types of FGM by the World Health Organization definition. And
can you just explain what the 4 types are?
So type 1 is basically either partial or total removal of the clitoris. Type 2 is partial or total removal of the clitoris and some of the external labias. And then type 3 is the most invasive. And one of the things that I always talk about is that every form of FGM has the impact that it does for the survivor, and it's for her to express that. So I don't think one is worse than the other. But type 3 is the one where basically they remove both the clitoris, partially or totally remove the clitoris, the external labia, and then pull whatever's left together and kind of stitch it up, which is called defibrillation. And the procedure I had at 11 was a defibrillation. And again, that was...
What's type 4?
Type 4 is basically any injury to the female genitalia, pricking, stretching, or anything for non-medical reasoning. And I think that's the core of FGM. It's anything that's done to the female genitalia for non-medical purpose. So yeah,
So then when you were 11?
So yeah, then when I was 11, I had a defibrillation, and again, this was another kind of formative time in my life. It was something that happened to me. I wasn't engaged in the conversation. I knew I was in pain. I knew I had kidney failure, but it was decided this was what was going to happen, and then I was just sent back at home. I was just sent back home, and for me, I always say that my FGM happened out of context. I've got there was no overt chastisation. I was freely educated. All these other kind of positive things were happening, but this was this very symbolic thing about my gender that happened to me. So I was just sent on my way. And for me, that was my decision that I was never going to engage with the whole conversation around FGM because I'd got the medical support that I needed. And I thought, do you know what, I'm just not going to have anything to do with that anymore. And I remember at the age of 12, I picked up 2 books. I picked up Animal Farm and 1984. And because I knew I was having this conversation about FGM with my cohort at the time after I had my defibrillation. And I said to him, why don't you go get some support? Or why do you not think this is a horrible thing? But what I didn't know was the fact that I was so engrossed in having the information and the conversation around FGM because that was the only thing that was happening to me. They had other things that they were dealing with. And I remember reading Animal Farm and assuming just like the pigs, I had a different view and everybody else was just kind of catch up. And that was basically at the age of 13, I just disengaged in terms of the conversation around FGM. But in me disengaging didn't necessarily...
When you say you disengaged, you just pretended it never happened, you just didn't want to have to think about it?
I just thought it was over. I thought everybody else is going to catch on, and it's not my place as a 13-year-old to be banging on the doors. But the really weird thing was that everybody else was talking at me and talking about girls like me and telling me that it wasn't happening. While most of my peers were being either taken to Dubai or they were being taken to Manchester or they were being taken to London to have FGM. So for a long time during my teenage years, FGM was an active practice to the girls that I knew, and it was happening.
We're talking about the 90s?
In the 90s.
The 90s in Britain?
In the UK, yes. But what was really interesting was that the legislation at the time only applied to FGM happening in the UK to British nationals or citizens. And a lot of people assume, so the reason why I don't use words barbaric or backwards is that there's a lot of conscious decisions that are being made, and I don't want to stigmatize survivors because this is an organized crime against gender, and a lot of the people that were carrying out FGM or a lot of people that were pro-FGM were very much aware of the legislation. So they were taking the girls to Dubai, they were ensuring that the girls that they were cutting here in the UK, there in the UK were non-citizens, so therefore the legislation didn't apply to them.
We'll come back to your story in a moment and how you became a campaigner, but just before we do that, I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of a global snapshot about the prevalence of FGM and whether, in your opinion, the incidence has increased.
I think awareness has increased, so a lot more people are coming forward. So globally, the UN says there's about 100 to 140 million women who are living with the consequence of FGM, and that seems vast. But in the UK, the numbers are not growing necessarily. The evidence is becoming is coming forward. So a lot of my peers who are not necessarily thought of as being FGM survivors are now coming forward. They're now accessing medical services, and for the first time we have a way of recording FGM. So if you do come into contact with a medical professional, you will be asked whatever your gender, not your gender. You have to be a woman, but whatever your race and your nationality, you will be asked whether you've had FGM or not.
Really? So if this is mandatory in the UK now?
This is mandatory in the UK now.
Okay.
And that was one of the key things that we wanted to have a conversation about, because for a long time we had this kind of theoretical number of 66,000 girls having undergone FGM. And my flatmate and cousin of mine actually sat down the other day and actually between us we named 150 girls that we knew personally related to that had FGM. So 66,000 was just the tip of the iceberg. So the numbers are growing, but it's not necessarily the prevalence levels is growing. In terms of the African continent where it's most prevalent, that there is a lot of work happening, but the whole conversation is that we're not necessarily hearing the positive stories. And my thing has always been to kind of champion the positive stories of change. on the continent.
How do you account for the fact that it's only certain countries in Africa? I mean, it's not just Muslim countries, is it? I mean, if you look at Egypt, for example, where there's a very high, was it 91% of
91%
of all women in Egypt have been subjected to FGM, and not all of those are Muslim.
No, it's wherever there's gender inequality, FGM is present. I think the concentration is different because a lot of people ask me why isn't there any FGM in Saudi Arabia? I said the whole legislation and the whole state, basically abuses and mutilates women on a day-to-day basis. So it's, I think, where it's one of those instruments where they use in order to suppress women. So it is more common, or more we're more aware of its prevalence in Africa, and that's due to the fact that people have been very open and very clear about that kind of conversation. But I think every society where there's no equality, where the gender balance, gender inequality is at such a low level, there will be some form of violence against women and girls.
But there's also, when you go across to Turkey, some of the Kurdish countries,
yes,
Malaysia, Indonesia seems to be on the increase in Indonesia.
No, it's always been prevalent in Indonesia, it's always been prevalent in Malaysia, but we're having those conversations for the first time because in terms of looking at FGM as a form of violence against women and girls, we're now looking at places where it's prevalent or where it's evident. So in the UK, where I was just talking about it the other day, that there's a certain borough, so it's a certain area of London, 1 in 10 births is to a woman that's undergone FGM. So if there's
one in 10
1 in 10 births is to a woman that's undergone FGM. So we have a high prevalence level in the UK, and what we've also done in the UK is anybody that reports any form of injury to the female genitalia. So we've kind of taken out of this cultural cul-de-sac that has been placed in, and actually reported any women that have gone through any kind of female genital cutting.
So we're talking about two situations. One is the incidence of FGM around the world. And the second thing we're talking about is the incidence of FGM within Western countries such as the UK, and we'll get to it in a minute, in Australia. So the question is whether or not, there are laws in the UK, and I think there are laws also in Australia that prevent girls have FGM done to them here. There's also laws that prevent girls being taken out of the country. How effective those laws are and how effectively they're enforced is something that you perhaps can talk about in terms of the UK. I don't think we really know for Australia yet.
Well, that's taken a long time. So we've had a legislation against FGM in the UK since 1985, and one of the key things that people always looked for was a prosecution, and I think ultimately that was a failure. And I always say I wasn't going to walk into a police station as a 7-year-old and say, I want you to prosecute my parents under the FGM legislation, Section 5. And also the fact that it happened to me in Djibouti meant that it was extraterritorial, so it didn't necessarily apply. And that kind of caveat in the legislation did not change till 2003. So if we are going to get a prosecution, ultimately, if we are going to get
there's never been a prosecution?
There's never been a prosecution. Well, there's been a prosecution recently, but there's never been a conviction. And that prosecution also came about because the DPP, so the head for the Department of Public Prosecution, was a human rights lawyer, and it was really interesting actually disagreeing with somebody that I studied at law school. But within the legislation, there was no re-infibulation, so stitching a woman back up wasn't actually explicitly expressed in the law that it should be FGM. So he went back to the Crown and asked the fact that this was in the spirit of the law, and they did in their way of trying to prove that the legislation worked, they did try to get a prosecution, but it wasn't successful. But in terms of, I think, I always say there's 4 Ps. It's about preventing and protecting girls from FGM, then providing provisions for girls that have been through FGM, so we can come forward and have those conversations and ultimately maybe lead to this elusive prosecution. And then there's partnerships. Unless we all engage in every different sector which children engage within. I'm not sure how it works here in Australia, but from the age of birth all the way up to 5, all children have a health visitor, so somebody that's in contact with them, checking their growth and checking how they are and checking their well-being. And then the school system comes into place, and then it's about education and actually getting education involved, and then social services, and then there's the medical staff, and then there's the policing. So there's been an undue criticism of the police in terms of the UK, but they can't do anything with that information, and that information hasn't been forthcoming. I do think we probably will get a prosecution, but that is because of the fact that we've worked in this kind of system. So, but there is a global ban on FGM, and that was led by the African continent. That FGM internationally is a crime. So we should all just use our legislation in order to make it easier for prosecutions to happen within the country, or for protection mechanisms to happen within the country. And since last year, we've now got the Serious Crime Bill, which allows social workers, schools, or anybody to take out a protection order in order to prevent FGM. And this has been very successful. So we've got several protection orders against children. And what's been really interesting in that is a lot of the women have actually come forward to ask for those protection orders, and a lot of the places where those protection orders have been applied have been women that have been also fleeing domestic violence, which again shows the fact that a lot of these women are not in a position to be making these decisions, to be making these choices, and to be protecting their children. So we have a duty on that kind of front.
But let's just now go back to you're deciding to become an activist on this issue, and can you just briefly tell us how that happened, how you decided to do that, and how you lit upon the kind of campaigning you do? It's very out there, very provocative in a way, incredibly humorous. Can you explain to us how you decided to do what you do?
I wish I could say that I woke up one day and I thought I really want to change the world and do something, but ultimately I came face to face with the results of my silence and how complicit I was in the conversation around FGM. Just after I graduated from university, I went into the fast stream, which is kind of like the civil service kind of thing, which you get. And I was asked by a teacher to go to a local academy in a city school to talk to some young girls and just kind of aspire them to go to university and fulfill their dreams and so on. And I went into this classroom with these really loud young girls who were very confident, and I was into.
How old were these girls?
So they were about 13 years old at the time, and there was 14 of them, and I was very intimidated by how forward they were and how kind of they were very confident. It seemed they were very confident, and I started to talk to them about going to university and the fact that there's several choices open to you, and all these other kind of things. That anything that I like, a mentor would do, or somebody that would try to be an ambassador from like their background. And I remember as soon as the teacher left, one of the young girls asked me if FGM was halal, and she put it in Islamic context, and I was very kind of thrown by that whole point of thrown by these girls who were born in the late 90s. I'm thinking, what do you guys know about FGM? And as I always say, I said two of the most flippant things in my life. I said, what do you guys know about FGM? Of course, it's not Islamic, but how many of you have even known FGM or had FGM? And out of the 14, 13 of those girls had FGM. And in that moment, I just...
And they'd had it done in Britain?
No, most of them had it done abroad, because that's one of the things that a lot of those people that are pro-FGM know, that it was illegal in the country, so they took them abroad. And it's very easy to confuse a child that doesn't necessarily know anything about a cultural identity to say that this act is part of your culture. So I think just like any kind of groomer would want to buy kids sweets and kind of confuse them in that kind of situation, that's the kind of things that happen. And I remember just standing back and thinking, how the hell could this be happening? It's like, it's Bristol, it's 2006, for God's sake. And I was in public health at the moment, at that time, in child protection. But I also remember not wanting to really engage and talk about my own personal experience. So I talked about it in a third person, put some beautiful policies together, and then left, and then went to London. and thought, okay, this is all going to be taken up because there's gateways and there's things to be done, and everybody else should just put it together and just get the acts sorted. So I went to London, and again, I met this, I was volunteering at the time, I met this young girl who'd gone through, who had type 3 FGM, and one of the interesting thing at the time is nobody was talking about the type of FGM that I had. Everything was much about, we're not doing FGM anymore, we're not doing infibulation anymore, everything's fine, get over it, basically. And I remember this girl actually putting this piece of artwork together, and she was showcasing this artwork, and everybody was...
Was this a quilt?
No, it wasn't a quilt. It wasn't a quilt. So it was a very graphic piece of artwork that she'd kind of it was her cathartic experience in terms of talking about that. And I remember her being late for this, and I'd had several coffees with her, and I always told her it was going to be okay, everything's fine. I never telling her it was going to be okay because I've been where she has, and I'm a survivor. And I remember her turning up late, and then everybody else saying, "Oh, you're late. Come on, get on stage." And this poor child was like hyperventilating, and I remember just out of nowhere in this room full of people just taking her aside and saying, "There's actually nothing wrong with you. Like you're going to be fine." And she asked me in that moment, "How do you know?" And I'm like, "Because I've been where you are, and it's going to be fine." And that was the first time I'd ever actually told anybody that I had FGM. And then within that moment, I thought, these girls that I saw a year and a half ago had undergone FGM, and they were 13, and this girl was 21, and she had FGM, and she had nobody else to kind of associate herself with. So in 2010, I linked up with some of the survivors of FGM that were already working on the conversation, and I said, let's frame this in a positive narrative and actually ultimately go towards ending it. And that's when I first spoke out, and I said, my name is Nimco Ali, and I'm a survivor of FGM. And when I was doing that, I had a Mitts Off My Muff card, and I thought humour is a very good way to deflect.
I'm sure some of you have seen that photograph of Nuimco in my magazine with a big sign, Mitts Off My Muff.
So it was a way. I think humour is a very way to kind of deflect, and not necessarily you can be very personal and have those kind of conversations. And I think it stopped me because I'd got over being angry, and I'd been informed, and I made all these decisions. But ultimately, when I was doing a lot of this stuff, and I do make lots of flippant remarks about it now, but it was really scary. I knew the shit that was going to hit the fan. But I thought, you know what, if you can kind of laugh it off, then it won't necessarily be as painful as I knew it was for other women that tried to speak up before me.
But what was it that made you decide that not just humour, but also a very provocative kind of campaigning that you've engaged with? I mean, tell us about when you first wore your fanny suit.
Yeah, I think it was because
Maybe explain to the audience what your fanny suit is.
So we've got these vagina suits that we wear in order to kind of have the conversation around the female genitalia, the fact that it's a very public conversation that people are having about our bodies, but not necessarily with us. So I thought we'd take it to Parliament, or we'd take it to the streets. And we started off with making these, what we like to call them, cunt cakes. And when you're doing this work, sometimes the puns write themselves. And I remember the time when we first made them, and then somebody said, "Were they homemade?" I'm like, "Yeah." And it's like, "Has anybody got a nut allergy?" And then we had this sign with these vagina cupcakes, or cunt cakes, as somebody put them on, and then with a little small sign of saying "may contain nuts." And that has actually always been the way that things have kind of gone on, because FGM is one of the most ridiculous forms of violence against women and girls, and people always wanted to sit around and kind of talk about it. So I thought, if I want to dress up as a vagina, and I'll come to a meeting in Parliament, if you really want to talk about vagina, let's have one in the room, and how these vagina suits work is your head pops out where the clitoris should be. So it's like it's right in your face. It's right in your face. And
there are photos.
Yeah, it is. It's right in your face, and it's one of these things that I just really wanted to kind of make it public, and I really wanted people to stop feeling embarrassed, and I also really wanted girls that have been through FGM not to feel ashamed. So I didn't necessarily want them to be there as a show and tell story, because that was a lot of the conversations that were being had, was the fact that tell us about your vagina as opposed to tell us about the act. So I just thought, why not wear a vagina suit? And they're like, I'll come as a talking vagina, because it was literally, it was never talking to me, it was always talking to my vagina, which is quite interesting, but it gets boring sometimes, yeah.
But you've had a lot of you do a lot of lobbying, you have a lot of meetings with ministers, and even you've been to Number 10 and you've met with David Cameron, and he's been actually pretty good on FGM in the last year or so. How do these guys react when you come and talk to them about vaginas?
I think one of the things is I'm happy to overshare, but I think the lack of sensitivity is what really shocks me, and the fact that and what I've learned from other survivors of other forms of abuse is the fact that it's been quite similar.
I guess the other thing that you've been, and I mean, as you say, you stand on other people's shoulders in doing this, but one of the things that you've done is to be able to successfully reframe the discussion of FGM away from being a community and therefore a private matter to being one about child abuse and violence against women. You just say, it's nothing to do with community, it's nothing to do with religion, it's nothing to do with colour, it's to do with violence.
It is to do with violence, and I always have my kind of own political ideals have been always like the personal has been very political, and there's nothing more personal to me than my gender, and I see that constantly being ignored or dismissed on a day-to-day basis in terms of politics. So I really wanted to kind of stand in solidarity with a lot of other my sisters that didn't have the voices or didn't have those conversations, and I wanted to talk about FGM as a form of violence against women and girls, and I'm not interested in ending FGM without actually liberating women, and that's one of the key things that I wanted to have that conversation. And it was also giving a lot of white feminists the permission to stand with us, and I think it's one of those things that it's not about trying to rescue survivors of FGM, but it's about supporting them, and it's about standing in solidarity. And in order to do that, we have to have the language. And I think this whole victim, poor Nimco kind of thing was one of those things that I never wanted. And I remember last year I met my feminist heroine, and she talks about how she was embarrassed about writing the first chapter of her book, Nawal the Salawi, about the defacing of Eve. And I said, what were you embarrassed about? What were you, what were you scared? No, what were you scared of? She said, I was scared. And I said, what were you scared of? You're this amazing goddess who's whose work is what basically gave me the foundation to speak up. And she said, I was scared of being labeled, and I was scared of the shame that would come with people just seeing me for my vagina. And I remember, and that was a lot of the things that kind of held me back as well. So I'm thinking, this really successful person that's got how many A-levels, got 3 degrees and all these things, am I going to be kind of brought down to just me and my vagina? And then I thought, what? I'm proud of, this is something that happened to me, something that doesn't define me, and I can either stay embarrassed and I can feel ashamed, or I can kind of get those people that have done this, or the people that want to ensure that it never ends, to be ashamed. And I thought humor and dressing up as a vagina was a very positive way of kind of doing that.
So what do you say to those people, men or women, who say, well, this is who we are, this is how, to be a true Somali woman, you have to be cut? I mean, what do you say to them?
I think FGM is not something that was part of our culture or cultural identity. It's something that was oppressed upon us, and I think it's always history, or learning your history is always a good thing. And there's another woman called Nuimco, and another amazing Somali woman called Edna Aden, who talk about the real feminists of the African community, and especially Somalia, the Horn of Africa, where I'm from. And she wrote this amazing book called Queens Without Crowns, about the way of the pride and the way that we walk. And she talks about having to leave Somalia because of the war, and then coming back from the West. And then the men saying to her, oh, do you know what, piss off with your white feminism and liberal kind of conversations. And she did the history in order to write this book, and found poetry from women about 300 years ago who never have seen a white feminist talking about the female god, because the male god that had sanctioned them with all these kind of domestic abuse, FGM, and all these things must be from a male kind of patriarchal kind of context. So if we look at our history, and that's one of the key things that I find in the developing world, or places like Pakistan or Africa, is the fact that a lot of girls are being disempowered and not educated. And if you don't educate girls about the history and the power within their own continent and within their own communities, then it's very easy for men to tell us that this is a very Western thing. And that's what's really dangerous in terms terms of how we in the West kind of treat issues like FGM. Let's talk about it as violence against women and girls, and let's stay away from issues like culture and so on.
So, one of the things that you talk about is, you're very adamant that you don't want images of FGM to be shown. You told me that if you Google FGM, the first thing that comes up are these photographs of it being done to young girls, and you're against that.
Yeah.
Can you explain why you think that's...
I think at the core of the conversation around FGM, and something that Efwa and I always believed in, was the do no harm principle. Come into a campaign and come into a movement in order to move things forward, and not to kind of dismiss it or kind of do any damage. And ultimately, I always check my privilege, so I will never stand somewhere and saying we need to take to the streets of Burkina Faso and combat FGM, because I know it's a dictatorship and those might be dangerous. But when it comes to FGM, these children have not consented to the act of violence being committed against them, and nor have they consented for their pictures to be taken. I am happy to risk my life. I'm happy to work 10 times harder than I have to, which is kind of impossible, but I'm happy to do that in order to get people to understand the horror or the ridiculousness of FGM, as opposed to showing an image of a girl. And I remember a really famous American journalist we wanted to commission her to do some pictures around FGM. So my thing was actually going forward and having a picture of a grandmother and a mother and a granddaughter, and talking about the lineage of actually ending FGM in a generation and how women can kind of work together. So beautiful, positive stories of change. That's what we got in the end, but it took ages to get there. And I remember her saying, I need to really capture the act of FGM. And I'm like, what does that mean? And she's like, I really need to capture the act of FGM happening. And I was like, that's a child, and that's a crime being committed against a child, and you're going to not only stand aside, but you're going to capture that. And I said to her, you know what? What I'll do is, I've had FGM, and I'm happy for you to take pictures of my vagina if you want to capture the acts of FGM. And she said, I'm not really comfortable with that. And I said to her, so you're not comfortable of taking a picture of a consenting adult, but you're willing to take a picture of a child that hasn't consented as they're being abused? And she said, fair point. So sometimes you might have to make hopefully my next kind of campaign, and one of the things that I ask people that are trying to campaign around FGM is, don't re-stigmatize a child or survivors by showing images of being cut, and don't contribute to the neglect and the abuse that we showed them. I'm sorry that we didn't save you from FGM, and I'm definitely going to be make sure that we don't necessarily re-abuse you by showing those images. So hopefully Google will be able to take down images of children undergoing FGM,
and that's going to be your next campaign?
That is going to be my next campaign.
Asking Google to remove those images?
Asking Google to remove it, and also from within the UK, defining images of children being shown, being cut as forms of pornography. It is pornographic information. It is pornographic and horrific pieces of images. So I don't necessarily know whether people don't necessarily get that or not. And I know people...
Well, you made the interesting point to me, Nimco, that you don't need to see a woman being raped to know that rape exists. You don't need to see somebody having the shit beaten out of them to know that violence and domestic violence exists. So why do we need to have these photographs?
Exactly. We have pictures of donkeys, really skinny, and saying no donkeys were harmed in the making of this. I'm like, well, can we not harm any children anymore by campaigning against FGM? So yeah, it's one of those things. I don't necessarily think everybody that shows images of children is doing it from a place of damage, but they are doing damage. So I think it's one of those things to keep having that conversation, to say it's derogatory, it's harmful to children, and it's also harmful to the cause itself.
You are just wondering if you could perhaps give us some thoughts. You've been in Australia now for 9 days, and you've met quite a lot of people while you've been here. And there's sort of the public campaign against FGM is probably just kind of getting started here. What sort of advice would you give us about how we in Australia should be taking on this issue?
I think don't come from a very victim blaming or either kind of savior kind of mindset. I think standing with survivors and solidarity is very key. And one of the things is the fact that I've met a lot of women and a lot of men from FGM affected populations living here in Australia, and they have wealth of information and wealth of knowledge. And the media can be very damaging and very derogatory to people sometimes, but they can also be positive, instruments of change. So I think engage with the media, but also set the narrative, and it's about talking about the fact that we can end FGM. I really dislike the word eradicating FGM as though it's some kind of virus.
You don't want to use eradicate?
I don't use eradicate because then it kind
so
of...
what do you say?
Ending FGM or preventing FGM, because it's one of those, it's a form of violence against women and girls, and it doesn't just happen. It's not polio, it's not Ebola. It's like, there is an actually systematic power and control dynamic within that, and it's not going to just end with having conversations. There is going to be a multi-level approach in order to do that. And my thing is the fact that to anybody that's out there that is scared of FGM, fearing that FGM might happen or FGM has happened, if they come forward, I know that there's a lot of amazing women and a lot of amazing people that are working here in Australia that will work with you sensitively. So don't fear, and we are here to listen. And for other survivors that are out there, you have the right and you have the privilege to check people that want to speak on your behalf, because nobody can tell your story. And I think there's nothing more powerful than actually listening to somebody and allowing somebody to tell their story. And from a Western kind of perspective, we have the platform, we have the privilege. Let's use that in order to do positive change and not necessarily move things back.
But what do you say to that? I mean, mostly FGM is instigated by the mothers. It's the mothers who want the girls to be cut. What do you say to those mothers? What do you say about their role in this? How do we break the cycle? How do we stop it?
I think FGM is always instigated by those in power, and I doubt in many of the cases it's the mother. So wherever the power lies is where the fault lies for me, and a lot of that is to do with the men and the patriarchal society, and with I think with mothers and with mothers, and one of the kind of conversations that I've had with people that I'm related to is ultimately understanding that the greatest gift that they gave me was not necessarily FGM. That's not who made me who I am. It was the gift of education and the gift to freely be me, and also giving back and apologizing that I'm sorry that there was nobody there for you when you needed somebody to speak up for you, but you can actually now be the agent of change. So I really want mothers or grandmothers or those people that believe that they're silent or believe that they don't have any power to understand that they truly are the keepers of power, and there are a lot of us that will stand with them, and that there is no such thing as a perfect woman. So whatever the communities want to create, that there is no such thing as a woman that can raise her kids, work 5 times a day, and raise their kids, work 24 hours and do all these things. And I think those are the things that kind of mirages, and we need to, as women within the community and also within the wider population, have honest conversations with each other. And I was really privy to the fact that when you first asked me to come speak, and the title of your book, The Damn Whores, and I think I am one of those damn whores where I do talk about my vagina, and it is one of these things that people want to kind of...
You definitely qualify as a damned whore.
I am a damn whore. I'm quite proud of that.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you. But I think as women, we don't also need to be God's police and kind of policing ourselves, because men do that enough for us. Society does that enough for us. And so...
Well, I remember when I first met Nimco, last year I was invited to go to London to Women of the World conference, and I found myself on a couple of panels with Nimco, and what really struck me when I first heard her speak, and she spoke about having had FGM, and she said that she'd had FGM, her mother had FGM, her grandmother had FGM, but her niece, who I think there was 3, her 3-year-old niece, was not going to have it, and she was determined to end the cycle, if you like, or end the tradition with this one generation. And you tweeted just a few weeks ago saying that in one generation you've gone from 100% FGM to 0.
Yeah.
And that your 4-year-old, she's now 4 years of age, it's not going to happen to her. And so this has been success. This is how you succeed.
I do always believe the fact that I talked about 100 million women, 140 million women, but it's all about the individual child. It's about the one girl and breaking that cycle. And for me, it's like FGM is a historical act in our family. And one of the key things that I I could have been sure that FGM wasn't going to happen in the context of the legislation happening and all these other kind of things, but I also wanted it to end within a framework of my niece being very free and fearless and having no boundaries in terms of her identity and the things that she can do. And I always say, like, you know, she is a empowered little bitch, but that's the way I like to call her. But and she knows what she wants, and she has those decisions. And I think within her, I see myself, and I see my mother, and I see all the women that I've kind of pushed a little bit forward every single generation in order to ensure that she's free and fearless from all forms of kind of gender-based violence or kind of any kind of limitations. And it's about ensuring that her wings are not clipped. And I always do say, like, you know, I always do say that you are my world, but the world doesn't revolve around you. But it's also, I'm always very keen on ensuring that she's also a well-rounded individual. But I want every single girl to be as lucky as her. I just don't want Sophia to be the only one that's, like, you know, free from all these things and thinking that she can be whatever she wants. And I remember just after she turned 3, and somebody put her in a book, it was like, no, she decided, no, I think she was 2 at the time, and somebody asked Sophia, so what do you want to be? And she said, I'm going to be a tree. And they were like, a tree? I'm like, yeah, damn right, why can't she be a tree? And she's going to be rooted in the foundations of knowing that she can do whatever she wants to do. So I think I never wanted her to lose that kind of innocence that she can do whatever she wants to do. So if she is a tree, she's going to be the first in our family to be one, but good luck to her. Well, so whatever, yes. Good luck.
But I mean, it does kind of raise the issue that she's very lucky to have had a very strong family member like you, who's been prepared to stand up to this tradition and to call an end to it. How is this going to happen across all these other families and all these other societies?
I think and that's what I mean. It's about having that conversation with those. I'm only a product of my upbringing. So I might have had FGM, but it was because of everything else. Is because I was raised by strong, amazing women that were around me, and it's about actually picking up those strengths and actually using it and pushing that forward. And I think within each and every one of us, there is that struggle, that there is that kind of radical voice that's about to be raised. And I always say that if you raise your voice, even if it's with a whisper, it's always about taking that first step. So it might not necessarily be an easy journey, but I think the first step is what it really needs. So if you really don't want FGM to happen, you do actively have a role to play. And within each and every one of us as well, whether we're social workers, whether we're teachers, whether we're midwives or whatever it is, if we know that somebody else is not protecting the child, then we have a role to play. And I hope that, so it's one of the things about mandatory reporting that we have, or asking people about FGM, is that I'm happy for somebody. So if I ever do have children, the fact is it's going to be evident that I have FGM, that I had FGM. I'm happy for somebody to ask the conversation of saying, like, you know, if I do have a daughter, are you going to cut your daughter? Obviously the answer is going to be no, but it ultimately shows that somebody else cares about my daughter. And I think a lot of survivors and a lot of young women that don't have, like, you know, somebody like me within their family are looking out to the wider kind of community. They're looking out to their teachers, they're looking out to their social workers, they're looking out to their peers to be the ones that can kind of speak up and, like, you know, protect them from FGM. So I think we all have a role to play. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a family member, it can be anybody else within the population.
And are you confident that's happening?
It is in some places, and I always say when the Prime Minister started talking about FGM, that was a key thing. I think one of the most interesting people that I met that said that Charles and I, so that kind of gives it away, was Camilla Parker Bowles. And she just, Charles and I watched the documentary and we're very interested in this, and it's something, the fact that it's, somebody said to me recently, like, you know, people are talking about FGM in polite society. I'm like, that's great. And we need to keep talking more about FGM, and we need to keep talking more about issues that affect girls. And we need to talk about it on a global agenda. And I thought what was really interesting was that Michelle Obama and even our Secretary of State for DFID was at the UN this weekend talking about getting 62 million girls back into education, or 62 million girls while they're out of education. Most of these girls are out of education because of FGM. So we can't necessarily look at the second level of oppression. We need to look at the beginning. And I think if we do end FGM, that's going to be one of the kind of greatest indicators of getting some kind of equality in the world.
I hope so. Just before we go to audience questions, I'm just going to ask you, a question which I know is quite maybe a bit controversial, particularly in Melbourne, and that is the question of language. The term FGM, which is the one that you use and the one which the WHO uses and I think United Nations uses, but there are some people who don't like the word M. They don't like the word mutilation because they particularly don't like to apply it to themselves.
Yeah.
They don't like to say, well, I don't feel I've been mutilated. And they prefer the word circumcision. So Nimco, what do you say about that whole kind of discussion, circumcision versus mutilation?
Basically, I don't like FGM full stop, like the actual act. But in terms of FGM, it's about, this is the word that was fought for by women on the continent whose experience was being very much dismissed for a long time.
The women of Africa.
The women of Africa and human rights lawyers and so on. It's sadly because the act is what it is, and I really hate that line because I used to get my young people to stop saying it. They were like, but it is what it is. I'm like, okay, fine, I can use it now, but FGM is what it is, and it's the consequences of the act of cutting ends up in the mutilation of the female genitalia. It can never be undone, and I think it's about the gravity of the consequences of the act, and I would never, so one of the things I would say, I would never project anything onto a survivor, and I would allow her to describe her experience however she wants to describe it. That's something I very much respect, but in a policy kind of context, I would always use FGM, and I would use the word cutting as to talk about the process. The word circumcision needs to be totally eradicated. That one can be eradicated because it's a poisonous thing. It's like it takes a few moments to do that from our consciousness because it's nothing like the male circumcision, and I think and that was the key point that they made in the 1980s, and when the global ban was happening recently, that it was FGM. So I think a lot of us in the West need to get over our sensitivities and listen to the people that are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. Last year, I was privy to be part of a scoping exercise into 10 African countries, and nobody in that continent wanted to use the word circumcision. The UN does like to use the clunky FGMC, but we ended up dropping that because there was a really good doctor, Dr. Kiati, who I love, he was like, who uses C? C nothing. I'm like, great, C nothing, so we got rid of that. So I just like to say C nothing is like, FGM is the term to be used, but allow a survivor to describe it however she wants to describe it. But don't undermine the struggle that's taken over 60 years in order to get to the place it is. So if we're sitting here having an intellectual masturbation session, as I like to call it, about terminology, then we're not really preventing FGM and protecting girls that are at risk.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we might see if there's any questions from the audience.
What is the justification? Why did it start in the first place, and what's the reason for it? Like, is there a medical, religious? What was the genesis, and why do people keep justifying doing it?
I think it started with a really hateful man. And I think that's one of those things like foot binding or anything else. It has no kind of place within society. So it dates back to over 4,000 years, and it's one of the things that was evidence in the Egyptian times and so on. But it's just kind of carried on because we haven't yet got to the place where women are equal and women are there within the decision-making mechanisms. I think if women had the choice, if women had decision-making powers, then FGM wouldn't necessarily exist or carry on. And there is no legitimate justification, but the real reason why it happens is the power dynamics, and it's very much easier to keep women occupied or keep them out of public life if they're suffering, and so it's just one of those things. A lot of the reasons why men don't necessarily want to end it, there's not been necessarily that much traction around it, is that it would ultimately mean that more women will have more time to question other things that are going on around them. So there is literally no justification for FGM, and that's one of the things why I think we spend too much time trying to figure it out. And for me, my answer was my gender. And it's the same thing as I don't think that rape is a sex crime, it's a hate crime. So it's just one of those things, it's about power dynamics.
But nevertheless, it is so incredibly widespread and has lasted for so many, certainly generations, if not centuries. it's something that's really kind of taken off.
It existed within our kind of the consciousness of a lot of people, white Caucasian people within the UK, where there used to be clitoridectomies for hysteria or for women that were lesbians or whatever it was, because it was one of these things. It was a form of control, and I think the first time it was ever the clitoris was first discovered was around the time of the witch trials in the UK, and then it was referred to as the devil's hood. And what was really interesting was the fact that same terminology actually popped up in Djibouti. So we were listening to there's this documentary called African Rising, and it's
called what?
Africa Rising.
Okay.
And actually watch Africa Rising. It shows you the amazing work that's happening in Africa, and all these great women having these kind of conversations. But it was really interesting because I went and searched for where FGM came from, and I remember reading this thing about where the clitoris was first, written about in terms of English literature and English kind of history, and it was around the time of the witch trials where they were drowning women because they were smart, and if she drowned, she was on a witch. If she floated, she was, so they killed her anyway. I thought, okay. And that's where the clitoris was first discovered. So that kind of shows you the realities of where this kind of thing is rooted, is the fact that any excuse to kind of carry out an act of violence against a woman was kind of given. There's also, with myths, there's also some kind of truth within it, and within the first processes of the fetus growing, the female clitoris and the male penis are literally the same organ. So if you give people that bit of information, everybody assumes that the clitorises are gonna grow into a penis. So there are a lot of ridiculous things that people think this is why they need to do it. But if you give them a piece of information around to counteract that, then ultimately that kind of just says, oh, I did not know that, so there's something that can kind of change.
But I remember you mentioned the other night, there are some of the incredible myths that still survive in some African societies about the power of the clitoris. For example, was it the gold miners?
Yeah, so where women are not educated and empowered about their bodies and their information. So I was Burkina Faso. The miners believed that if they didn't have a clitoris around their neck, then they wouldn't be able to find gold. And I always say that in the second poorest country, it's really good that they came up with a very economical issue around FGM. In Tanzania, there's conversations around the fact that if you don't have the clitoris in order for the fishermen to go away with, they're not going to have anything to bring back in terms of using it as bait. In places like Kenya, women believe that if the clitoris touches the man's penis, then he dies. And I'm like, men in the UK are fine. So it's like, so this is the thing about sharing information, is the fact that we need to share that information and saying, and I remember, and this is the thing about how, you can be given information, but it's contextualizing it. I remember I was at Bristol University, and it's one of the best universities in the world, if I do say so myself, but anyway. And there was this Kenyan girl that was there, and she was talking about how she needed to have her clitoris removed because otherwise her husband is going to die. And I said, well, so I said to one of the guys that was in my class, and I'm like, Tom, tell her that you've had sex with a girl that's had a clitoris and you haven't died. And she said, well, maybe it's just African men. So then I had to go find an African man that slept with a white woman who hasn't died. And then it was kind of like, well, maybe it's African men that only sleep with Kenyan women. So honestly, to try to disprove that one myth, it took such a long time. So imagine having to find a Kenyan man that slept with a Kenyan woman that hasn't had FGM. It happened in the end, but it's this whole thing, it's something that she's believed so deeply, and it's so hard to just say, well, obviously that's not going to happen. And so, yeah, it is quite powerful. The myths are quite powerful. The sanctions and the rewards in terms of FGM within a society are quite powerful. So for me to walk in and say, oh my God, that's like violence against women and girls, is something that's really difficult for them to take on. So that's why it's really good to have the conversation at a level of trying to protect girls, and then having a level those that actually have power so they can ensure that it comes down.
I wish to say to you, brava, Nuimco, you are leading the tertiary ascendancy of the female Homo sapien species and led the secondary with Flo Kennedy, Germaine Greer, etc. But you are doing such a wonderful, courageous thing. We're deeply indebted to what you're doing. I have a question about the brutality of this and it being driven right to the top of male behaviour. I personally don't believe in gender-based violence or family violence. To me, it is male violence, and it should be called male violence. So I'm asking you, does this go right to the top of male power lust to do this stuff with the brutality of the surgery, and should it be called out as male violence, which is the way I see it?
I'm a radical feminist, so I could say yes. I'm a heterosexual radical feminist, so I've got over my Muslim and Catholic guilt, and that's the other guilt I have to deal with. Like, you know, but yeah, it is violence. So it's violence against women and girls, and I do, yeah. So I don't want to demonize all men, and I'm not going to demonize all men. There are men on our side, and there are women on the other side. So it is violence against women and girls, and it is about power dynamics, but. It is about power. It is about power, and those that hold power are men. And if men had a conversation about actually ensuring that the male ego is a very fragile thing, and we constantly have to always massage it, and we're kind of getting bored of it, because if that's kind of becoming the fact that we have to be in pain. So it is male violence against women and girls, but I do also believe that men can be on our side and men can stop this. So I'm not one of those people that wants to just blame men for everything. It is violence against women and girls, and I know the terminology is to use violence against women and girls, and you guys use family violence here, which we don't. But it's to kind of ensure the fact that, like, you know, that there is a way. And I always say that this whole kind of hyper masculinity is dangerous to men and deadly to women, and I think that's the kind of way to have that conversation. And I'm happy to say, like, you know, that I was happy to meet some men here in Australia that are looking at deconstructing that, actually challenging the conversation about what it is to be a man. And I think men can be lovely, men can be loving, men can be brothers, and we really do want to welcome you on the other side. So yeah, just stop being arseholes sometimes.
Hello, Nimco. Hello. First of all, I want to say I'm a very proud Somali woman today to see the conversation happening in Melbourne. And I'm also a very proud Australian because I hold the conversation from this other end. And I work with young women on the issues of FGM. I have written a book myself, and I have written about my experiences. And on the subject of men, actually, my father was very much against it when it happened to me, and it was done by my mother. And that comes back again to the myth and the stories that women have, and they want to protect their young ones from the communities. But my question for Nimco is, how do we empower these young women, and especially to involve this conversation with young men as well? And I know that for me, it has been about phases. And of course, life is always about phases. But there was this phase of being a victim, and then you come to that phase of anger, and then you profoundly find that space to hold a conversation like what you're doing tonight, this phase of empowerment. So can you share with us a little bit, because I find that some of our women and young women in Australia, especially here in Melbourne, are very shy in this subject. And I also wanted to say that I follow you around the world and watch what you're doing. And I love your work and applaud you for it. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for what you're doing. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you know what? It means a lot to hear from another Somali sister. And I think the thing for me is that sometimes I have been a little bit brash and I have been a little bit out there because I want to kind of break those molds of what a Somali woman should be and what an African woman looks like and should have those kind of conversations. But I think us, like, you know, each and every one is ready when they are ready. But it's about having an honest conversation in a safe space. And if you provide a safe space for a sister, then it's very much open to them. And I think it's about having information as well when they really want to ask. So if you can just provide that safe space and it's not challenging, then that's fine. But and also sometimes questioning those that I always love the word why. Every time somebody wants to kind of say something like, you know, pro FGM, I always say, why is that? And if they have to use it religious or just because, then they know they're failing. So just keep asking that question, why, when you come across really challenging people. And I learned that from my niece. So,
I think if you want to follow what Nuimco does, one way to do it is to follow her on Twitter, and her Twitter handle is at Nimco Ali. Perhaps you could explain to us why your name is spelt differently on Twitter.
with a K.
With a K, not a C.
Yeah, that was meant to be my undercover name, but it doesn't really work very well when you're dressing up as a vagina. I knew, and that's like, you know what, I applaud you for speaking up, because there are a lot of people that want to kind of do you harm for speaking up about your own kind of experience. And this is the reason that it kind of brings FGM back to you, and the whole power dynamics is like, the number of people that had wanted to kill, number of men, that have wanted to kill me. I was fine when, like, sisters essentially wanted to strangle me for oversharing, but they were doing it just like through words, but not necessarily physically trying to attack me, because it is really difficult for somebody to implicitly tell your story or something that's very similar to it. So I thought I'd go undercover and spell my name with a K. It didn't work. Trust me, it did.
Because there was also a photograph of you, right?
There is a photograph. So the first.
This is the first time Nuimco went public with the issue, right?
Yeah, the first conversation, the first kind of thing I ever did was with the Evening Standard, which is, and I think, again, giving, Efua was an African goddess that's kind of done a lot of amazing things, but I also want to kind of really give thanks to a lot of white women. I've done a lot of amazing things in the UK. So Jude Kelly, who's the founder of the Women of the World at the South Bank Centre, gave me a platform for 10 minutes on a Saturday morning to talk about my experience. And in the last 5 years, that kind of conversation has gone on from ministers sharing the stage with me to have a conversation. And Sarah Sands, who's the editor of the Evening Standard, put her trust to tell the positive stories of change around FGM. So we did this whole, my first article around FGM, and I said, I'm a survivor of FGM. I put on a hat. So we call that hat media. So I put on this really yellow hat and then tried to hide and then spelt my name with a K. And I thought, nobody's going to know about this, because I know there's really horrible people out there that want to do me some harm. But yeah, it didn't work. People found me. So there's, I think that's why I spell my name with a K. But for any survivor that really wants to speak out, do you know what? There's a lot of us out there that wanted to support you, but also don't feel like you have to put yourself at risk, and that you have to necessarily share more than you want to. And in terms of if there's anybody in the media here, I think just be sensitive about the fact that it's really brave to talk about your own experience. And I know we want to have as much information, because not a lot of people talk about it in Australia. But apart from you, amazing that you're doing that. But it's don't be too. Don't ask too much of women that just come forward, because it might just be the first step that they're taking.
Yeah, and it can, as you say, it can be dangerous. It can actually be physically dangerous.
Yeah.
And it has been for Nuimco. So I think, we should salute her courage in standing up the way that she has. Is there another question?
Yeah. Thank you, Nuimco. My name is Batsy, and I'm from Zimbabwe. And I share in the solidarity of your amazing story. And thank you to my friend here, who's actually encouraged me to come along and in supporting Africa in general, and representing southern part of Africa. My question, I think you've already touched on that, and that was in relation to your personal connecting that with the political. And I think you mentioned before you do like to overshare a bit, and I wanted to hear a bit about your experience from a personal level with your family relationships. You've talked greatly about your niece, and I think that's a great story, and I'm just wondering, what's the relationship like with your mum or your dad and other extended family who, coming from an African background, extended family is just as close as immediate family?
Yeah, it's been a hard journey, and I think one of the things that my mother necessarily never understood, and I love her for, is the fact that why, if FGM was never going to happen to me again, and why so I basically in 2010 gave up my career in order to dress up as a vagina and talk about my vagina on national television. So you can understand that that's not a proud moment for an African mother. They were like, I thought your daughter went to university. She's like, she did. So it was, but I just thought it was one of those things that I thought it was the right thing to do, and I thought I was immensely privileged, and that I needed to use that privilege to kind of have that conversation. And my politics has been, it has always been very personal, and the fact that I'm a liberal, I believe in humanity, and I believe in the fact that we all have a duty of care. And I couldn't sit I couldn't sit in a meeting room with girls I knew out there were being cut, and I knew that girls were being failed. And also, it was ultimately about getting rid of certain ghosts, as my 7-year-old self, my 11-year-old self, and so on. And I can happily say that I do have a mother that's ultimately against FGM now, and she completely understands the principal levels of the fact that it's violence against women and girls. And it's interesting that it took David Cameron talking about clitorises to make that happen. But she thought, if a man that is so far removed from the issue can have the conversation, then why can't she? And I love her for the fact that she raised me the way she did. And I think certain things happened, and in some weird way, I do believe in parallel universes, and I know that there's a universe that she was empowered from a younger age, and I wouldn't probably know necessarily what won't be cut. But yeah, I have a family, so yeah, I have family, and I do have a lot of friends that are really close to me, but it was a really painful experience, and I wish I didn't have to go through it. I wish I didn't necessarily have to fight as hard as I had to in order to explain the decisions I made, but it was something that I was willing to sacrifice, because I was standing, and my grandfather, who's basically the love of my life and the guidance, was kind of the buffer that I had, that he gave me the permission to speak up and to do these things. And so did my grandmother. My grandmother just laughed a lot of the time when I always talked about something. So I'm grateful that I had a lot of support from that kind of perspective, because if I hadn't, and I always say the fact that because I'm so outspoken and I'm so out there, that if something happened to me, then somebody would find out and somebody would know. But I also know that on a day-to-day basis, there are girls that disappear, there are girls that don't come back, and it's for them that I overshare, and it's for them that I definitely make my politics very personal for them.
For me, time feels very short. There are children in danger in Melbourne, and I'm wondering if it's possible to have a conversation about what's next in Melbourne and what it would look like if it was different.
I'll definitely come back to Melbourne. I'm happy to do that. I think hopefully it won't, and I was having a conversation with Paula, who's from No FGM Australia, and ultimately I think there's been things done in the UK, and it's like, your political system and your legal system is very similar. I'm not sure if your political system is similar, because we don't stab our prime ministers in the back as much. It's really weird. It's like, still got David Cameron, who ended up getting a majority. I don't know. Anyway, so that's a different conversation to be had. But I think there's a lot of things to be learned from the UK, and there's a template that you guys can use. And yes, sadly there are children at risk. But if you know, please tell somebody, because about preventing that one case of FGM for that one girl, that is start breaking that cycle for that generation. Because as I say to everybody, FGM is one of the most ridiculous things to reinvent if it's not in your consciousness. So that's one of the reasons why it carries on so much, is that fact that it's actively there and it's been actively practiced. So there's not a space to have that kind of conversation. Then it becomes legitimized and legalized and normalized within a society, and then it's really hard to unpick. So if you can save one girl, I think take that upon yourself and do that. And it's not about ending FGM globally. If everybody plays their role, then that can happen. But it's about thinking about that girl that's next door. And when somebody tells you that FGM is not happening in Australia, then please question that and ensure that they don't necessarily pass that misinformation to other people.
Nimco and I had a pretty incredible meeting in Sydney last Friday with a group called, this is a New South Wales Health Department group called No FGM Health Education Program, and we met all these women who are bilingual community workers, and they're from a range of countries, mostly African countries, but also Indonesia, and their job is to run these courses with women from the community to educate them about living in Australia, because most of them are refugees, but also about FGM and the fact that it is against the law and how to deal with all of that. And what was pretty incredible, I found, about that meeting was several of those women, these bilingual community educators, workers, had said that they had actually gone to the police to inform on women who were in their groups, women who couldn't be persuaded not to take their daughters out of the country. Yeah. And these women who were the educators, the community workers, had taken this drastic step of basically dobbing in people in their classes, and it was a very, very brave thing to do, but they felt so strongly about it, and that's what they did.
And I think I'd be immensely grateful as a 7-year-old if I'd known I was going to have FGM and I told somebody and somebody told the police. It's like, I'd say thank you now. But yeah, it's one of those things, is the fact that, and FGM would have ended in my family a generation earlier. So I think it's one of those things, is that we all have a privilege to do something, and we should use that, because...
And we definitely have the law on our side. I mean, the law had the penalty I'm not sure if it's a national law or a state law, but certainly in New South Wales the penalty has been increased to 21 years.
Hi Nimco, my name's Therese. Thank you so much for being a public face for this. I'm an Egyptian Australian and my mother was castrated. I'll call it castration because I know the adverse effects that it had on her mentally. And she was a Christian and she was raised in Egypt. And I'm really curious around how you reconciled the fact that you really didn't believe in what was happening to you, but you came from a family where it occurred.
I think again it was finding my feminist voice, and I think it was. I remember I would have used that word castration. I remember when somebody said that to me once, when you were castrated, I was like, okay, it might literally be the kind of the right terminology, physically, but it's just one of those things. Anyway, that's another. But it was actually understanding the power dynamics and how much power that they had within her kind of remit. And I think my mother didn't have necessarily the power to say no, but she thought she had she thought she was doing what was. It's this whole kind of thing of if you can't end the FGM, then try to make it as nice as possible. And I think that's what a lot of women, when you have the reaction, when you get the young girls reacting towards it, it was but I did the best that I could. And it's one of those things, is the fact that I realized that for me, it wasn't necessarily very beneficial having the conversation from an angry perspective to my mother, with my mother. It was very much having this conversation of a position from the fact that I'm sorry that you didn't have somebody that was there for you, and the same for my grandmother. So I think it's about, again, just checking the privilege and see how much things have moved forward. The fact that I can stand tall now and have the decisions and have the power to say no for my for my niece or any children that I might have, and also for me to be allowed to redefine what it is to be a woman. And I think for me, I don't think that the most painful thing around my experience of FGM was actually the act, but it was more about the context and the experience of living with the whole dismissal of my own experience. So I think it's really great, the fact that now women want to talk about it and women want to share or understand that you can talk about your own experience and talk about the pain and the struggle that you went through. So it took a long time, but then I also had to kind of check myself in terms of how I was having the conversation, because I didn't think it was very helpful for me to be really angry and really flippant, which wasn't necessarily a positive kind of conversation to be having. But yeah, no, I do love my mum, and I do respect her. At the age of 29, she got divorced and she raised 6 kids on her own, and she's she's been an amazing kind of feminist and role model to me, but she doesn't necessarily call herself a feminist. So I think that is the kind of the little different, the generational kind of thing. And I think she did want somebody that was a little bit more vocal than she was, but I don't think she wished for this vocal. So I think, she might be rethinking about how strong that she'd kind of raised me to be. So I think she learned from her experiences and kind of just tried to change things, and I've learned from my experiences of being raised in that kind of context and kind of try to push things forward a little bit more as well.
There was a question here.
My name is Ligisti. I'm one of those people who work in the field. Thank you, Nuimco, for this open conversation. We know there has been a lot of work for the last 20 years in Australia. mainly raising the awareness of the community, not to continue with the practice, and hopefully the awareness is increasing. My question is, we know this is, political and social issue, and especially my interest is in the young women from your experience in the UK. Do you have a place for them where they can come and be supported, not only in medical fields, but in the social aspect of it? We have seen some of them, they come across as they don't want to know anything with it. They are so traumatized. Yeah. They have survived it, but they are traumatized and they don't want to know what's happening down below the waist. And some of them also, they don't want to be different to the other communities, and they don't want to know it. And how do we support these women? Like you, great, and others who have come out and campaign. So is there a way of, addressing this? The campaign is great. We need to increase, and we need to raise it. But is there a place in the UK from your experience? How do you support these people? Thank you.
Yeah, the psychological kind of support for young women is just starting, but there is an amazing organisation called Integrate Bristol, which works...
What's it called?
Integrate Bristol. So
Integrate Bristol.
Integrate Bristol, and they work specifically with young people, but this is one of the things is the fact that for a long time... For a long time, the medical provisions that were around were all about the physical and not the psychological. And again, that's something that's developing at the moment, so young women can go forward and actually ask for psychological support around that issue. So this is one of the things that in Australia, while you do when you start doing the cross government working and that whole kind of conversation of looking at the needs of women, it's about looking at it from every single aspect. So it's not necessarily adding things on later. So you can kind of look at from the education to the physical to the psychological. But I think the psychological needs of women is a very key thing. And what was really interesting was that last year before I think a lot of people assume that African women don't have a psychological need. And I remember talking to one radio person going, she's like, tell me about the physical horror of FGM. And I was like, actually, the psychological issues are a lot more difficult. And she just wanted to know about the physical acts of FGM. So, but it does have a long-term psychological consequences. And I would always stress, especially when you're living in a culture where it's not the norm. It's like, and everybody's questioning it. I think we need to always support girls psychologically and emotionally. And that's why one of the main reasons, again, about not using images, about the triggering. And if anybody here as a survivor, if anything has triggered, I know, again, just have a conversation with Paula. I'm just keep directing everything to No FGM Australia, but I'm sure there's services that they can kind of connect you with.
Thank you. My name is Yassine. Thank you, Nemo. Actually, we need 10 like Nemo, actually, to change most of the laws happening here in Africa, too. In my perspective, the other coins for the men, especially the young men, we work very, very, very hard to let them understand the woman is always, she's a victim, especially the one we know, my sister or my daughter. Just a couple years ago, I went back to Africa, to Sudan. So my neighbor, I saw a lot of music was going on. When I asked what that music, a lot of dignitaries sitting the same like here, in watching one of the victims sitting there, a women doctor come to mutilate the young girl or the child. So when that's happened straight away, everybody was happening, and I don't know how can I say it, waiting, the sign of happiness. So all the mothers sitting there, I wish my daughter to do it the same like this one next time, just after 1 year. The other women say the same thing. So those women, they need a lot of active person to talk to them, to tell them, to educate them. And unfortunately here in Australia, all of them, they come in here. When they come here, the men get from the women to get married from that circumcised one. Oh, please don't touch the uncircumcised. The same like Nemo said, if the uncircumcised one, she may go out from home. She may leave you. So we start now, Neil, about a year to educate that young men through the sport activities, through the other activities. Please, the women always a victim. Understand her, not victimized. So Nimo, how you can advise us? How we can work with the men? What we have to do? Still, they don't want to listen about this one. This one female problem is. So, what's your advice?
I'm understanding you saying that men still want women that have been cut.
No, from the mothers and the mothers come in the thing. They tell them don't touch the circumcised one. Uncircumcised one, it's dangerous for your home. They're talking to the other coin from.
Okay, I think we had this conversation last night, and I think it's very interesting the fact that it's a psychosomatic thing. It's the fact that if everybody, it's a peer pressure thing. So the fact that if you're having FGM and you're being celebrated, and then everybody else wants it because they want to be the same. And I think in terms of young men, I think we have to also look at within your kind of cultural narrative how you educate men and how you educate women. And I think the different vessels that you create. So if you just think boys can be anything they want, but girls can only be the whore or the Madonna, then that's not fair. And I think that's where, and then you have to look at where FGM sits within that kind of context. And I think there's only two narratives, again, open to girls within certain populations, or even in the West as well. Either you are the whore or you are the Madonna. And the fact that we're not, as women, we can be whatever we want to be and allowing choice. And I always say, when men always talk about FGM, they say, my daughter, my wife, my mother, women are evidence without you. So it's one of those things as how do you see women? Do you see them as your fellow citizens, or do you see them as somebody that's only evident through you? So the narrative of how we talk about women is, again, very key. So you're not going to be able to teach boys to respect women if you're only going to be talking about FGM, but then you're still going to tell them to chase a girl that's unchaste and virgin and all these other kind of things. So it's about empowering girls and allowing them to be active citizens. So equality is the only way we're going to address that.
Right. Thank you, Nimco, first of all, for your generosity in speaking to us today. I just wondered, in view of the fact that no man has really been prosecuted for this crime yet, what about men in the Muslim communities or other communities that carry this thing out? Are there any men in those communities that you found support from?
There have been a lot of men are supportive. So the gentleman here that was just speaking, the fact that he's anti-FGM and it's about how to challenge those things. But in terms of prosecutions, there have been several prosecutions on the continent because they very much understand that. And there's also been there's also been prosecutions in France, but I don't necessarily think I want to.
There's been some in Sydney too.
There's been some in Sydney. There's cases going on, but I think. Some of the men, so I was the head of the International Federation of Gynecology. He's a Sudanese man who's from a country where FGM is 98%, and he's been very supportive about ending it. There's amazing men in there's an organization that where the definition for FGM came from is called the Inter-Africa Committee on Harmful and Traditional Practices. And there's a lot of men on those boards, and I think there's been a lot of leaders that have been very supportive around the issue of FGM, ending FGM. But it's about, I think it takes both of us to to go forward in that kind of way.
Thank you, Nico. My name is Tom. I'm from Kenya, so in your myth, I might be a survivor. Now, there are three things that I've recognized that they really have a lot of influence in the African setting. That decide or influence the way people do things. The religious leaders, community leaders, and the school system. Now, we have always seen that there's a lot of very minimal discussion in terms of the religious leaders and the community leaders. It becomes worse when the community leaders are religious leaders. What is your experience in engaging the religious leaders, especially the Islamic religion, which I think you are part of, or what do you think would be the best way to approach it from that particular area, angle? Thank you.
I always go from a gender human rights perspective. I don't necessarily go from, because it's not Islamic, it's not Christianity, it's not any of these things. So to try to use something that it's not even based in as a way of ending it, it's not really helpful. And then I also find it quite problematic that a lot of religious leaders are not very egalitarian. So they might want to be against FGM, but they're not against other stuff. So so I don't necessarily engage, so there is it's not in any of the text, it's not anything to do with religion, so I don't use it from that kind of perspective. But I think, again, it's the whole thing about if the community leaders are men, then that is the problem. So it's about power dynamic. So I think to say it's not Islamic makes it the fact that there must have been some Islamic ruling somewhere. To say it's not Christianity, it's not. So I don't necessarily engage with religious leaders.
Look, before I thank Nuimco, I'd just like to thank a few other people who have made tonight possible. Jan Owen from the Foundation for Young Australians, who took responsibility for bringing Nuimco from Sydney to Melbourne, and as well as me, for which we're grateful. I want to thank Jenna Price and Destroy the Joint, who paid Nuimco's fare from the UK. Paula Ferrari from No FGM Oz. Paula's here tonight, started a relatively new NGO wanting to fight FGM. Jade Ganane, who was on the door and has been running around with the microphone. Thank you, Jade. And thank you, Nicole Janame, for helping out as well. Thanks also to Jodie McInerney and Stephanie Amir for their wonderful work in helping us sell tickets for tonight. And finally, I think when I met Nuimco at Sydney Airport at 5 o'clock last Sunday morning, I saw this sort of shell-shocked person who didn't realise that planes flew that far.
That long.
That long. Didn't realise what she'd signed up for in making the long trek to Australia. I really want to thank her not only for doing that. It's an incredibly arduous trip. We Aussies are used to it, but the first time you ever do it, it's pretty amazing. But more than that, I think what Nuimco has done in the 10 days that she's been in Australia, in Sydney and in Melbourne, not these are the two events she's done with me, but also the many meetings she's had with groups, is to really help us start to bring this subject out into the open, to really shine a light on it, to start having the public conversations that will lead us to do what they've done in the UK, and that is to fight it openly and hopefully make this the last generation of Australian girls that undergo FGM. So I'd really like to thank Nuimco very much for her oversharing. Without her courage and willingness to speak frankly to us, I don't think we'd have developed the understanding that we have from what you've said. So thank you, Nuimco, very, very much for what you've done.